A thing I've been thinking a lot about is the difference between grit and flow. We've been taught to kind of grit our way through things, to push through, to knuckle down, and we've seen that celebrated as kind of a cardinal virtue in our culture. And I think that what happens when we do that, when we get into the habit of that, is that we start to treat everything as hard. And we start to look around us and everything seems difficult, and we lose those opportunities for joy in the journey or in the process of getting to where we want to go. And when we hold things a little bit more lightly, we come to our work, for example, with a sense of ease, as opposed to, this is going to be so hard. I know this is going to be so hard. But we bring a sense of play or ease to it. It opens up more opportunities for that in the day to day.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. Today I'm excited to be joined by Ingrid Fetell Lee, designer, author of Joyful, and founder of the Aesthetics of Joy. Ingrid, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to have a conversation about your design research and how we can fill our lives with more joy. But before we do that, I'm curious, how did you find yourself into the design world and ultimately make the connection between design and joy?
I graduated from college with a degree in English and creative writing. I went to work in market research and then branding. And I started to get curious about design. I was sort of adjacent to designers. I was working with them all the time, and I became curious about design. And I knew that I didn't want to be an architect. I didn't want to work on large buildings that would take years and years to be completed. And I didn't want to work in fashion. And I was kind of wondering what else there was. And I discovered industrial design, which is also known as product design. And it's everything else, right? It's all of the physical objects in our lives, everything from cars to tableware to furniture, all of those kinds of things. And so that's what I went back to school for. It was about 5 years out of college when I went back. And while I was in the process of getting a master's in industrial design, I had a review where a professor made this offhand comment. He said that the work that I was presenting, because I'd had to present all of the things that I'd made over the course of my first semester, he said that it gave him a feeling of joy. And that was really the first time I had heard these two ideas together. Right? That things could create joy, because we always talk about how money can't buy happiness, and joy is this very intangible, very fleeting thing. And so the idea that things could create joy was really intriguing to me. And that's what really started me off on this journey, which now I'm, 15 years in, to understand that connection between the physical things in our surroundings and our emotions.
We don't talk a lot about joy. The word we'll use more often is happiness or even excitement. To you, I mean, for me, often joy seems a little formal. I am, one time I had a mentor who I had a big success, and he says, "I'm rejoicing in your success with you." And it seemed a little silly.
That's a beautiful way of saying it.
It was really nice, but it felt a little over the top.
Right.
What is the difference between joy and happiness in your definition of joy?
It's true. The word joy, I think, often ends up being used a lot in religious contexts or spiritual contexts. But from a scientific perspective, joy and happiness, though we use those words interchangeably, mean very different things. So happiness, I'll start with that since it's maybe the more common term, is a broad evaluation of how we feel about our lives over time. It has to do with whether we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, how connected we feel to other people, how we feel about our health and our work. All of those things go into making up a kind of complex equation that we call happiness. And happiness is sometimes hard to know in a given moment, right? Because one part of your life can be going great and another part of your life not so great. And you wonder, how happy am I? It's not like you can just put a finger in the air and be like, oh, I'm a 7 out of 10. It's hard to get a handle on all those different factors. Whereas joy is much simpler and more immediate. So when psychologists use the word joy, what they mean is an intense momentary experience of positive emotion. That's one that we can measure through expressions like smiling and laughter and feeling like you want to jump up and down. So those expressions are a sign that in a given moment, we are feeling happy, we are feeling joy. So if happiness is how good we feel over time, joy is how good we feel right now in a particular moment. And I think that distinction is really helpful and really powerful because you don't have to have everything going right in your life to feel joy. So that moment, when your professor wanted to rejoice with you, he was celebrating a specific moment. And we can look out for those specific moments, small ones and big ones, even if the baseline conditions of our lives are difficult in a particular period of time.
Another one of my mentors said something really profound once. He does a lot of work with aging and kind of end of life people. And he had a friend who had ALS, and he would ask this guy, what makes a good day? And he thought it was so amazing to live in a world where a guy with ALS could have a good day, and somebody who looked really successful and might be in the top of their career could be riddled with self-doubt.
Totally, right. That contrast, because when you have less, actually, some of those small joys really mean more and you become more focused on them. And I think our culture has a way of focusing our attention on big milestones. So we think about happiness as being associated with buying a house, getting married, achieving a promotion, getting a raise, getting a new job. All of those things we tend to see as markers of happiness. And the problem with that is we can't control a lot of those things. Often, if we only focus on those things, we actually tend to sacrifice joy in the present, right? Because we're saving so much for the down payment that we don't want to go out and have a drink with a friend, right? We start to kind of shrink our lives to meet those bigger milestones. And then when we get there, there's so much pressure on them because we've sacrificed so much to get there. And so this tends to create a sort of negative loop where we get to an achievement. It's not what we had hoped. It doesn't make us happy. So then we look for the next one. Psychologists call that arrival fallacy, where we think we're going to get there and be really happy, and then we don't. Whereas when we have less, sometimes it allows us to really focus on the present. Someone facing a terminal illness, I've heard similar things from other people with not the same diagnosis, but other diagnoses that are, initially really traumatic. And, after a talk I gave a few years ago, a man came up to me and he said, I'm not happy about this diagnosis I've received, but I have noticed that I am feeling more and more joy in my day-to-day as I get to appreciate the time I have with my family.
That's really wonderful. Can we talk a little bit about joy and why it's so important, in the sense of, like, it's interesting because you'd be like, hey, I want to optimize for the long term. When I hear you describing happiness, the word that comes to mind is fulfillment or contentment. But what have you seen the power of optimizing for some of these short bursts of joy, which often can happen spontaneously? Like, what have you seen the impact that has for people?
There are a lot of things, actually. And I think we often frame it as a today versus tomorrow, right? Now versus the future. And I think that's maybe a philosophical construct that we've been given. But when you actually look at the research on joy and finding joy in the moment, studies show that there are a lot of benefits that also influence us in the long term. So, for example, research shows that business leaders make better decisions when they're in a state of joy, that doctors come to a correct diagnosis more quickly, that negotiators reach more win-win agreements, that we're up to 12% more productive in a state of joy. Studies show that our cognitive flexibility increases in a state of joy, which also helps with creativity and sort of broad-minded thinking. We're less likely to put people into stereotyped categories when we're in a state of joy because of that cognitive flexibility. So we're more open-minded to people and to new ideas. There's research that shows that we're also more resilient in a state of joy, that we recover more quickly from adverse events, when we allow ourselves to feel little moments of joy while we're coping, our relationships get better. We know that having small moments of joy deepens our sense of trust and intimacy and connection in relationships. So these are, small bursts of joy. When we share them with our partner, for example, when we share them with coworkers, those things tend to snowball and actually start to create what psychologists call upward spirals. So we have one moment of joy, it makes us more open-minded, more productive. Then we have another moment, we're more attuned to seeing joy, so we experience more of it. And over time, that starts to look a lot like happiness. So even though we've been sold this idea that joy is a distraction or it's a reward for hard work and we're supposed to just keep plugging away until we get there, actually allowing ourselves more experiences of joy in the present can help us get to some of those longer term goals.
When you're sharing that, I think of flow to a certain extent, and then just the presence. Like, we get so outcome oriented that we forget that this process is the thing we're going to look back on and smile. So I love the invitation to settle in and enjoy the small moments of the day to day.
Right. A thing I've been thinking a lot about is the difference between grit and flow. We've been taught to kind of grit our way through things, to push through, to knuckle down. And we've seen that celebrated as kind of a cardinal virtue in our culture. And I think that what happens when we do that, when we get into the habit of that, is that we start to treat everything as hard, and we start to look around us and everything seems difficult, and we lose those opportunities for joy in the journey or in the process of getting to where we want to go. And when we hold things a little bit more lightly, we come to our work, for example, with a sense of ease, as opposed to, this is going to be so hard. I know this is going to be so hard. But we bring a sense of play or ease to it. It opens up more opportunities for that in the day to day.
I've had a lot of conversation about that. It's something I'm really fascinated with. Stephen Pressfield was a recent guest. He wrote The War of Art, and he talks about the battle of resistance. So like this really hard thing that you have to do to pursue your potential. And then he talks about, and then Gay and Katie Hendricks were on the show, and they have a concept called zone of genius. And they are, as they're saying, genius is easy. And so I asked Pressfield, I was like, how do you contrast those? And he says, for me, the tough part is sitting down at the keyboard and starting. The first 20 minutes, like, it seems like that part's going to be there, and then it is easy. So I thought that was super cool to hear him say that, because it's something I've been thinking about for a long time.
I'm interested to hear that too, because I read that book, God, years ago, and I had that model for such a long time. And I had that model that it was hard to sit down. And I actually have been really experimenting with alternative approaches, things like the natural way of writing, and approaches that are very driven by wonder, that are driven by sitting. When you sit down, you don't sit down like, oh, this is going to be so hard. Or you do Julia Cameron's morning pages. And I found that when I use some of those techniques, first of all, I know morning pages aren't hard because I've done them, countless times. I know some of these strategies in the natural way of writing are not hard because, you just sit down and they sort of lull you in, as opposed to, oh, I have to sit down and do this very hard thing. So I think that we can even reframe that moment of sitting down by giving ourselves a kind of more gentler on-ramp into the work, as opposed to saying, oh, I have to sit down and immediately just go straight and look at a blank page.
Yeah, I just made a connection between what you were sharing earlier around people often say joy is now, fulfillment is later. There's some connection. I think a lot about limiting beliefs. Like, what am I believing and what am I basically making true? I think a lot of people have limiting beliefs about like work and making money has to be hard. And what I'm hearing you saying is we have opportunities to break either or thinking. Like, yes, like writing is somewhat hard. Teasing out something to find the right way to say something that resonates really deeply is very challenging, but it's also some of the most fulfilling stuff you can do. So it sounds like what you're saying is we just have a really great opportunity to break either or thinking and embrace the complexity and contrast that comes with some of the most fulfilling experiences we have.
Totally. And I think that one of the studies that has been sort of venerated in our culture is the marshmallow study, that study that says that, if they put kids in a room, they put a kid in a room with one marshmallow and this experimenter leaves the room for 7 minutes. And then if they come back, they get 2 marshmallows if they can wait the whole 7 minutes. Right. And so, this is like a test of self-control, a test of willpower. And what they've shown, is that apparently there are all sorts of benefits that accrue to the kids who can wait. That being able to wait is, shown to have benefits for your health. You have higher SAT scores. They followed these kids for years. But I think what's really interesting about this is, now people are starting to go back and re-examine this study and look at, there are very good reasons why some children choose to eat the marshmallow in the moment. And in some situations, it is the more sensible decision, right? If the experimenter looks shifty and you're worried he's not telling the truth about coming back to give you that marshmallow, then you're going to have a different perspective about whether or not you should eat that one. Sometimes it is sensible to enjoy what you have in the moment. And some of those initial results are being questioned. And I think it's really interesting. We have this society that just is so obsessed with the long term and the long term fulfillment. And, we work and then eventually we get to retirement. We work all week and then maybe we get a day of rest on the weekend. We're constantly deferring joy. And I think that I'm happy to see us starting to question whether that trade-off is an either or actually can be, there can be good reasons for finding joy in the moment, and that can benefit you in the long run too.
I had a guest a few months ago named Dr. Corey Keyes, really cool guy, just retired from Emory. He's one of the leading researchers on human flourishing and the founder of the positive psychology movement. He wrote a book in 1998, I believe, with Jonathan Haidt called Flourishing. Jonathan Haidt's obviously really big right now for the work he's doing around smartphones and such. But Dr. Keyes was saying how, we were much happier before, like studies show that we were happier before the 60s, not because everything was great, but because we were getting our value and our happiness as a byproduct of having meaning and purpose in our lives. And these days we're trying to get happiness without those things. And it's a lot harder.
It's interesting. I think that at the same time, one of the things that I would say is we have kind of concentrated meaning and purpose in work. And work has basically, employers have taken advantage of this to suggest to us, right, that this is our place of purpose and meaning. And I think one of the byproducts of that is that it kind of has hollowed out some of the things we do outside of work because they feel meaningless and they feel trivial. And so people have stopped doing their hobbies unless they can turn them into side hustles. They don't want to just go on fun runs because they have to train for a marathon, right? Everything has to be super serious and hard and difficult. And I think that that concentration of this idea of meaning and purpose in work and the obsession with meaning and purpose makes it really hard to just relax into your life, enjoy your leisure time, feel like your leisure time is well spent as opposed to, a waste of time that you're not hustling and you're not, meeting your goals. So I think I tend to see our obsession with meaning and purpose. I think meaning and purpose are important and valuable, but I think we can get it from many different places. And one of the problems is that we have really concentrated it in one place in our society.
It's very clear that your work has expanded well beyond design. I want to talk a little bit about design and then go back to how we can apply these principles in other areas of our lives. It blew my mind when I was reading Joyful, when you talked about how having the same colors present in multiple rooms can provide a greater sense of comfort. Can you speak to what you found in your research and really how you even did your research to make some of these findings to help us optimize our spaces for more joy?
So when I left that review where that professor made that comment, I started looking around the world, asking people and looking at, people all around the world and what do they find joy in, and talking to them. And what I found is that there were certain things that seemed to be joyful all over the world. There are things like bubbles and kites and tree houses. There are things like rainbows and rainbow sprinkles, polka dots and stripes. And so we see certain things that are emblematic of joy everywhere we go. We see them in big celebrations and things like that. And so I started to wonder, what is it about these things that makes them so joyful? And I began to notice that there were certain patterns. There were certain things that these joyful objects or places had in common. Bright color was one, a sense of symmetry or repeating patterns, a sense of abundance and multiplicity. So like those rainbow sprinkles or those polka dots, so things that give you that feeling of like being a kid in a candy store, a sense of lightness or elevation. And altogether, there were 10 of these patterns. And as I started to try to make sense of why would these things be universal, I found that there were really good evolutionary reasons why we would be attracted to these things, because they were very consistent features of our environment during the period in which early humans were evolving for many thousands of generations. I mean, it's really only since the advent of agriculture that we've been living in, settled civilizations. For the rest of our history, which was thousands and thousands and thousands of generations, our ancestors were doing the same thing in the same context. And so it makes sense, for example, another one is round shapes. It makes sense that we would be attracted to round shapes because round shapes are the safest shapes, whereas sharp angled shapes could be dangerous to us. And so it makes sense that we have a natural affinity for circles and spheres and kind of bubbly shapes. And then what I started to do was look for evidence from neuroscience and psychology research that would support that these things are universal. And for example, with round shapes, we see that when neuroscientists put people into fMRI machines, they show them pictures of angular objects and round objects. People's amygdala, associated in part with fear and anxiety, that part of the brain lights up when they look at angular objects, but not when they look at round shapes. And so, some of the research, it's a really interesting synthesis process, because some of the research has to do with looking at studies from neuroscience. Some of it has to do with actually going places and examining, talking to people in these contexts. Some of it has to do with looking at, real world results from places like, for example, Public Color, which is a nonprofit which goes into New York City school districts and transforms some of the most neglected school districts with vibrant paint. And, what they find is that attendance improves, graffiti disappears, and kids say they feel safer in those buildings. So some of it is, from the lab, and some of it is from real world experience, but put all that together and you can really start to see how our environments influence us in this very unconscious way.
So you speak to some very core principles regarding colors and shapes and such. Can you speak a little bit to innovation and design? I'm so fascinated by innovation in any sort of art. Like, I think a lot about the Impressionalists, like just a couple guys that agreed and saw the world in a similar way until they tried different things and then it became a new genre of art. Can you speak a little bit to innovation? Because I think it's fascinating that we see just these massive shifts from, the wood paneled office to like really sleek, like sometimes really modern, almost concrete floors, kind of like Tulum feeling kind of trend we're seeing. And I'm just curious to get your take on that.
I'm not sure that, I spent a number of years in the innovation space, but I'm not sure that's really my core expertise in terms of how innovative movements arise. My work is really focused on what is timeless and what is, universally true, and has been true since, our ancestors going way back. So for me, I always find innovation intriguing. And I think that there are certainly some interesting, aesthetic principles, around how we can start to, look for, novel ideas, but it's not really the core of my work.
Yeah, it's helpful. I think I'm about to release an episode with a guy named David Marks out of Tokyo. He wrote a book called Culture and Status. As you're sharing that, it almost seems like it's not necessarily design innovation, but it might almost more so be psychological innovation because people crave novelty and newness and being on the cutting edge.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think it's true. People do crave novelty.
Yeah. Are there small tips you give to people if somebody says to you, hey, I want to increase like the joy I feel in my home? Or what would you say to them?
Yeah, lots of things. Houseplants are a really good start. Natural textures, natural shapes. There's a ton of research that shows that just being around plants can influence our stress levels, our focus and concentration. I think adding color. So thinking about, it doesn't have to be any particular color. Any hue of the rainbow is good as long as it is sort of brighter and more saturated. So the more light it reflects, the purer the color, the more joyful it will tend to be. So when we live in these gray and beige environments, it tends to feel, you walk into an office that's all beige, it certainly doesn't feel like a very joyful place. Well, that color is a big part of it because it kind of dampens everything. It's very sort of numbing feeling. Also adding more variety. So it doesn't mean that you have to paint your walls. It could be just adding a little pop of color through a throw pillow or a bright coffee mug that goes on your desk. Painting your front door is one of my favorites because it's the first thing you see when you come home, the last thing you see when you leave. And it's also something that gives your neighbors joy as well, right? As they're passing by. So I love thinking about things like that can give joy, not just to you, but to others in your community.
You mentioned the importance of nature in Joyful, and you specifically had some really cool realizations about nature in our modern life. Could you share what you learned when you stepped deeper into nature?
Well, there are a few things. One, it seems we evolved to prefer a certain kind of open space. So there's a really interesting theory called the savanna hypothesis. And this suggests that because we evolved on the savanna, that was where most of human evolution took place. We tend to prefer environments that have what is called prospect and refuge. So we love views, especially elevated views or distance views where we can see what's happening. And we also love refuge. So we love a place to take cover. We feel safe. It's probably why we love to have our backs to a banquette in a restaurant and not to a door, because we love to be able to see what's going on. You can kind of apply this to the open plan office. Open plan offices often leave people feeling really exposed, like they're being looked out on, but they have no actual sense of refuge. So creating spaces that have a little more alcoves and privacy and nooks while still giving sort of broader vistas can be really helpful. One of the other things that I think is really interesting about our relationship to nature is what's called attention restoration theory. And the idea there is that for some reason, natural environments restore our ability to focus and concentrate better than anything else. So when you take a break, if you take a break looking at nature, you're much more likely to feel refreshed and restored and able to do your work than if you look at a screen. I know it's so tempting. We break from one screen and we go to the other, we go to the little screen to sort of check in with the feeds, but taking a walk in nature, having a little dose of nature can be really helpful. And there are so many more findings, everything to do with, lowering stress levels, blood pressure, cortisol levels. There are large scale population studies on this now. There are studies on, nature exposure and increasing creativity. I would say it's the most established body of research in terms of our relationship to our environment. So it's really fascinating to dig into.
I think what you're sharing about spaces, thinking differently about spaces, specifically in the office environment, you're good. specifically in the office environment and like healthcare. It's like crazy that like these places are places we spend so much time and we made them so dreary and depressing. Daniel Pink wrote a book called When, about the science of when to doing things. And I really like what you're sharing about breaks. His formula for like the perfect break is some combination of being outside, moving, eating something, being with people, and some element of like human to human touch, whether it's a high five, a handshake, or a hug, or anything like that. So I think that's a really cool reminder. When did you realize that this was like much bigger than just design? Because obviously, if you read Joyful, there's different types of joy journals and kind of like audits you can do to kind of track your energy. When did you realize it was bigger than just design for you?
I think as I began applying these ideas to my life, I started to see that many of them are not just aesthetic principles, they're also values. So, for example, abundance. I wrote about abundance in the book and this aesthetic of, feeling like you have a lush environment that has, more than you could possibly need, and how that's really not about stuff, but it's about texture. It's about not about material abundance, but sensorial abundance. And as I started to spend more time thinking about this idea, I began to notice that one of the things that brings joy, if abundance brings joy, an abundance mindset also brings joy. So when we are in a society that primes us to think in terms of scarcity and competing with other people, and trying to that our joy comes at the expense of someone else. That's like a big one that we have, where we feel like a friend got a big raise and suddenly we feel worse about what we have. When we are primed to think in that way, that joy is a zero-sum game, we end up having less of it. We end up hoarding, we end up being stingy, we don't end up sharing as much. And so you can really see these, not all of the aesthetics, but some of these aesthetics, start to speak to ways of living and ways of thinking beyond just, how we set up our space.
Are there parts of the joy equation that you feel are most overlooked by people?
That is a good question. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote Joyful is because I felt like a lot of people overlooked the physical. They overlooked the sensory quality of their surroundings. And so they were doing tons of meditation and all the good happiness habits. And they were doing it in these kind of soul destroying gray and beige environments, and not realizing the unconscious influence of their environments on their well-being. And hearing from people who have taken, some of these ideas on board and transformed their surroundings, I think what I have seen is a kind of emotional freedom. Like people feel a little bit more like they can let loose. They feel a little bit more in touch with their own creativity and their own sort of authentic preferences and their own selves. And that to me is, the space can be a gateway in an unconscious way, but it can also be a gateway in a conscious way, because it puts us in touch with our desires and with what we really enjoy and love in our surroundings. And it can become a springboard to much more joy.
When you're sharing that, I was thinking about this concept of a joy ROI. And just sometimes there's these little things that aren't expensive that just had a huge impact. You mentioned like a vibrant colored coffee cup, or an oversized coffee cup, or one for me is having a lot of towels. Not expensive, but it feels luxurious. Do you have any high joy ROI items you'd recommend for listeners?
Oh, it's a great idea. I love that concept of high joy ROI. And I think the reason this approach works so well for that is because these are things you're using again and again and again. So anytime you invest money in your home to make it more joyful, that is something that you get the dividends every time you use it. Framing kids' art, I think, is one that is very high ROI. because it's the kind of thing that it just comes in and out and you're deluged with it. But if you have a few really quality pieces on your wall, it brings a lot of joy. Other things that are high joy ROI, that is a great question. I don't know. I mean, right now, so I have a thing about softness. And so I have sheepskins like everywhere, and they're really not that expensive, but they make everything soft. And so if I'm sitting on the floor playing with my kid, or I'm sitting at I sit on a very plain wooden bench, but I cover it with a sheepskin. That to me is like high joy ROI. My milk frother is high joy ROI because I can make matcha at home every day. That's high, so things that you really enjoy, I think, I resisted buying that for a really long time. In fact, I waited until my husband bought it for me for something. And I'd wanted that for so long, but it felt so frivolous. So I think that often those high joy ROI things are things that we deny ourselves because we don't feel like they are important or significant. And yet now that I have it, I can feel the value of it so much. So I think if there's something that you've been thinking, I think I would enjoy that every day, that's your sign to get it for yourself.
And milk frothers are not expensive. So I think that's a really fun one for people to think about. Do you have any upcoming projects that you're really excited about?
Yeah, I recently worked on a wallpaper line. So that should be coming out in 2025. And I have been working on a couple of new books that I'm not quite ready to talk about, but I have been working on too. So
that's healthy. Yeah. I asked Stephen Pressfield that same thing. He was basically like, none of your business. Not really. He was able to share some details, but it's a really personal thing, and it's really powerful to keep those private. So I really appreciate that.
I think timing it's important.
Yeah. And it's honoring yourself and honoring the project by doing that. What's the best way for listeners to keep up with you and the work you do?
You can find me at aestheticsofjoy.com. You can find me at Ingrid Fetell on Instagram, and sign up for my joy letter, which goes out usually every other week with links and ideas and all sorts of things to make you find more joy.
Awesome, Ingrid. Well, we'll have links to all those in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays with Morrisey. That conversation was with Ingrid Fetell Lee, designer, author of Joyful, and the founder of The Aesthetics of Joy. What I enjoyed about the episode was Ingrid's emphasis on design and how we can design our spaces and our lives to feel more joy. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.